Third eye level, self-mastery, is 175 and the SQ chart. Your energy field is so polarized, all the karmas in the system have been dissolved. We finally get to the crown chakra, 200 plus range. Very, very rare for someone to arrive at. The Ramana Maharshis, Neem Karoli Babas, Christ, Buddha. He was a singularity level being who was just incapable of speaking as an individual person anymore.
Do you have any quick tips for people on how they can begin to raise their spiritual intelligence?
Absolutely.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so honored and excited to be here today with Aaron Abke. Welcome, Aaron. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Melissa. My pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's just start. And if you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey and a little bit about your enlightenment experience that you had.
Sure. Well, you and I were just talking about before the show started how we both grew up religious. And so that was where everything kind of began for me in my life, was growing up as a pastor's kid in evangelical Christianity in the Bay Area of California, and was a very devout Christian, very sincere in my faith, loved Jesus more than anything, talked to Jesus all day in my head, that kind of Christian. And when things came to a head for me was when I was 23, after I had gone to Oral Roberts University, got my degree in music and theology to be a pastor like my dad and follow down his footsteps in ministry. But everything came to a head when I got my first church job at a church that was teaching things that I didn't really grow up around in my dad's church, more of the fundamentalist side of Christianity. I was in a very spirit-filled church growing up where we did miracles, signs and wonders, worship services for hours. And, we would dance in the sanctuary and stuff. So we were really free-spirited as far as Christianity is concerned. So we didn't talk about hell. We didn't talk about, women being inferior to men, the rapture, all these kind of dogmatic beliefs until I was 23 and had this full-time job as a worship pastor at a church that was obsessively teaching that stuff. Very hyper-focused on hell, scare God into everybody, who's in the club, who's not in the club. And it just put such a sour taste in my mouth. And it forced me to decide if I believed in that version of God. And at age 23, I just said, I don't see this God in the person of Christ. I don't experience this God in my heart. And I'm sorry, but I'm a Christian, not a Biblian or a Paulian or any other kind of Ian. I follow Christ, right? And Christ didn't say any of this stuff. So I'm going to be true to my faith in the God revealed in Christ and leave this behind. And so, I was cast out as a heretic essentially by all my friends and most of my family. So I kind of blew my life up, moved back to Oklahoma where I'd gone to college, started seeking, any spiritual tradition that I could find that resonated, which obviously was Eastern traditions, beginning with Buddhism and then more heavily since then has been Hinduism, and really understood non-duality for the first time. And that was very helpful for growing up in a religion that didn't really teach the knowledge of God at all. We didn't have, any understanding of the divine, metaphysically speaking. I mean, the closest thing you could say Christians have would be the doctrine of the Trinity, which, has some good angles, I would say, but is mostly, a human invention or attempt to understand the nature of the divine. So I was really satisfied with the understanding of God, but kind of abandoned the devotional worship aspect of my faith for many years until I began to sort of run dry on the inside. And that inner worshiper in me that I'd been my whole life started crying out saying, knowledge is great, but I want to worship God. I love God. I want to know God on an experiential level. And so I kind of ended up merging my original faith, Christian faith, with the Eastern traditions I'd learned through this kind of devotional non-duality, which is sort of what I teach on my channel now, more of a balanced approach of the masculine and the feminine, equally in our pursuit of the divine. And so I ended up having a kind of spiritual experience at 27 that, people would call a experience of enlightenment or a sudden enlightenment that lasted for about 2 weeks. And that was what really put me on the track to becoming a teacher, because once I had glimpsed that that state of consciousness was absolutely real and available, nothing else really mattered to me anymore. And I just sort of decided to devote my life to, number one, figuring out how to return to that state of consciousness permanently. Because for 2 straight weeks, it was unbroken experience of just samadhi, total peace of mind and happiness. So I knew it was possible. I just sort of had to back engineer my way into it again. So I spent many years doing that. And the second part of that commitment for me was that if I could figure out how to re-access that state in a permanent way and ground it, I would devote my life to teaching the world how to do it. And so I guess all my teachings on YouTube sort of came out of that commitments I made to myself at 27.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Aaron. So, one thing that I've noticed as someone who's also come out of a religious background, especially Western religion, is that a lot of it can tend to be empty head knowledge, really. And that's not to say that there isn't any benefit, because I think there's a lot of benefit in religion. But what I appreciate about your teachings is that you make spirituality so practical and something that people can actually experience, and experiencing that samadhi state, which we don't tend to focus on in Western religion as much. So I like to talk about that because that's more the focus of your new series, if I'm understanding it correctly, is actually helping people to experience that state. So could you talk a little bit about spiritual intelligence, or SQ, and how did you become aware of this?
Yeah. So this was one of the, I would say, like main sort of lenses that I understood my experience at 27 through, was that, like, if I had to describe it in words, what's the main difference of that 2 week state you experienced and then now when all the suffering is happening, like what's the main difference? One of the ways I was describing it to people was that I felt less intelligent, and obviously not IQ intelligent, but there was clearly some kind of intelligence that was there for those 2 weeks that left or got obscured or covered up. And so I just started calling it spiritual intelligence. But in looking for a definition of what do I mean when I say that, right? For a while, I sort of just referred to it as someone's level of self-awareness, which is a pretty satisfying definition, I think. But for me, it didn't feel like that was totally it, because it felt like maybe just half of the equation, but not the full picture, because we have sort of two aspects to what we are, masculine and feminine, as we've said. And the self-awareness aspect is the masculine, but there's a feminine aspect too, which is the integration of that awareness into our energy, into our being. And so you can be at a stage where you're very aware, like this is what psychedelics do, right? They make you very aware of all of your distortions and imbalances and tendencies, to the point where it can overwhelm you. But people can't integrate it. And so they feel chaotic in their mind, and they're like, get me off this drug. It's terrifying. So the feminine is what's needed to ground and integrate that awareness into the beingness. And so I ended up deciding that what felt most accurate and really resonated in my soul was that spiritual intelligence is one's capacity for self-awareness and integration. And so capacity is a big part of it, right? Because everyone's entering this life at a different level of karma or evolution. And so, Law of One talks about this really well, the densities model, that some souls are coming here from a much higher density level. So their frequency is way higher than a native third density soul. So they just have more capacity to be self-aware and to integrate. So that was the first definition that made sense to me. And the next one that came sometime later was one's comprehension of reality, or the ability to comprehend reality, is spiritual intelligence. So during those 2 weeks, Melissa, I felt like, the way I described it to people was that it felt like, have you seen the movie Idiocracy?
I haven't.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sure most of your
I'm
viewers
sure
probably
a
have. It's
lot
a
of
great
people
movie
have.
to
Yeah.
watch. It's a movie where Owen Wilson's brother plays this guy who, I think he gets frozen in a time capsule and then wakes up like 400 years in the future, but everyone's really stupid. And he takes a while to figure out, like, no one's making sense. And he ends up realizing, oh, everyone's like gotten way dumber in the future. And so it was like as if only the unintelligent people reproduced and the intelligent people stopped reproducing or something like that. But society went like this over those 400 years. And so I felt a bit like Owen Wilson's brother in Idiocracy, but not from a judgmental point of view at all. But like what was so clearly obvious to me, as if it's just everything in the universe is screaming this truth of oneness to you. People seemed blind to it and would say and do things that felt so like, are you just completely ignorant to what's right in front of your face? Like, how do you not see that the nature of everything is oneness, that there's only one being, that you aren't this body, you aren't this person? Like, what could be more obvious than that? It felt like that, but it wasn't, again, a condescending thing at all. It was more of like a shock and this realization of, oh, I used to think that stuff and I used to suffer because of those thoughts. Whoa, man, I must have been some like drooling imbecile or something. And so when the experience wore off, and just for those who may not have heard my story before, it wore off because I woke up 2 weeks to the day that that experience had happened. It happened while I was at work at Google one day on my break. And I woke up 2 weeks to the day, checked my phone, realized it was 2 weeks. And the first kind of ego thought crept back in and said, wow, it's been 2 weeks in this state of consciousness. I wonder if I'm enlightened. And so something in the mind tried to claim that state as there's an I who is enlightened, rather than this is just the natural state of what is. It's what belongs to reality itself. Nobody claims it or owns it. And I didn't catch that that was egos. I sort of thought, wow, maybe this is a permanent state of consciousness for me. Wow, that's a great thought. And slowly the ego crawled its way back into supremacy in my mind again. And I felt that state slipping away. And it felt like I was getting dumber from a spiritual standpoint. Like the things that were so obvious to me, just being aware of thoughts, understanding you're not the body, not being identified with anything, knowing that everything is one. Every person I see is just myself in another body. Super obvious, right? Kindergarten stuff. Well, now it was like, I can't connect with that anymore. Like my brain is defaulting back to this old model, like some old hardware or something that's out of date. And people seemed separate, and I was identifying with thoughts again. And it was really a terrifying experience because I knew it was all an illusion, and I couldn't stop it from, fighting its way back into the captain's chair of my mind. So that's my first sort of context for it all was, oh, the universe is kind of showing me that this is actually a different kind of intelligence, in that you can be extremely brilliant from a linear intelligence standpoint, mathematics, physics, whatever, and have an IQ over 200, but have really low self-awareness and not comprehend the nature of reality at all. So it's a different kind of intelligence. And when I started asking questions about it, like where does this intelligence come from, and how do we gain more spiritual intelligence? Books like The Law of One, Course in Miracles sort of helped illuminate that for me a bit, especially the Law of One, talking about the 7 energy centers. So I just said, okay, if spiritual intelligence is clearly a different kind of intelligence that exists, then it can be mapped in some sort of way, just like anything else. And there needs to be some kind of system we can use to sort of get a feel for the spectrum of spiritual intelligence. And the energy centers made sense. So I sort of just, what's the word I'm looking for? I sort of just mapped the SQ chart onto the IQ chart from 0 to 200. And that's just sort of like if you look up, IQ charts, you'll usually get a 0 to 200 scale. And then after 200, they just say, super genius level. Doesn't matter after that point, right? It's so rare that someone reaches that level. So I just did the same thing with the energy centers and mapped each one is 25 points different, beginning at 50. And when you understand the nature of each energy center, you understand the kind of intelligence that energy center opens up to us. So it's really through my understanding of the energy centers, through texts like the Law of One and a lot of Hinduism as well, that all the dots just sort of got connected for me. And I ended up just sort of naming each energy center based upon the general idea of what kind of intelligence unlocks at that level. And what we see is that the average person really never makes it above the navel from an SQ perspective. They never reach higher than the first or second energy center on the SQ chart, which means they're just trapped in delusion and insanity and suffering until more spiritual intelligence is gained, where we can actually comprehend the true nature of reality. And the true nature of reality is perfect and fully loving, fully peaceful, eternal, infinite. There's no suffering in reality. So, really, all of our suffering, in a sense, we can say, depends on our level of spiritual intelligence.
Right. Thank you so much for explaining that. And coming to this understanding has been so helpful for me on my own journey.
Yeah,
Yeah. So then could you just like briefly tell us what each energy center represents?
absolutely. Yeah. So, the first SQ level is the level of insanity, which is 50 points on the SQ chart. And this is the level where someone is mostly just concerned with survival. This is the level of a lot of deep victimization mindset of the whole world's against me, everyone's against me, poor me, no one likes me, I never get ahead, that kind of thinking. That predominates at this level where really, the root chakra is all about the energy the root chakra provides for the beingness is the energy to survive. So when we're just at that level, that's the only thing that's of concern to the mind. And so everything is fear based, everything's separate, a potential threat, something to be overcome. It's an extremely stressful place to live. And this is definitely the level of SQ that all of the worst atrocities of humanity are carried out on. The next level is the sacral chakra level, which is the level of ignorance, and that has a 75-point value. And this is where a little bit of personal empowerment is gained, where there's actually a desire to succeed in the world. The sacral chakra is a chakra that gives us the energy of our personhood, our personality, and our individuality. So the desire to succeed, to make money, to have success or notoriety in some way, that's a sacral chakra energy that's charging that. So at this level, people are still very ignorant of reality. There's still a ton of suffering, but it's a little more of a sophisticated level where, you can now be a normal adult, a normal sane adult in the world without having tons of dysfunctions and drug addictions and stuff that people at the lower level of insanity would be struggling with. And then the third level is the level of empowerment at the solar plexus level, and that has a 100-point value. And I will say that I also scored the SQ chart this way because I wanted us to have a helpful reference for what should be expected or what's typical in terms of SQ. So if you know what a typical IQ score is or what a high IQ score is, you could say that that would also be a high SQ score. But the difference is that our SQ as a species, our SQ as a species is much lower than our IQ. I think the average IQ, I want to say, is around 90. I could be wrong. The average SQ is about 60 to 75, somewhere in there. So we have a lot of catching up to do in our spiritual intelligence. But so 100 would be considered above average. And that's where the empowerment level begins. This is where somebody is going to start being interested in self empowerment teachings, right? Like law of attraction. The law of attraction, when someone gets interested in manifesting their reality, they're definitely reaching that 100 plus level of SQ where their consciousness is now aware that my mind can influence reality, right? So that's a higher comprehension of reality. And then the fourth level is the level of awakening at the heart chakra, and that begins at a 125 SQ. And this is when someone is truly going through a spiritual awakening. So actually having, mystical experiences, oneness experiences, these things to happen at the awakening level where the heart chakra is opened. And when the heart chakra opens, it gives us access to the awareness of oneness. So it's no longer just an idea in the head. We actually feel ourselves because the heart is an emotive energy center. We feel ourselves as one with people. There's a deep compassion we feel for everybody. We're very concerned and interested in people's well being. And we start to contemplate who we are in the universe and who we are in relationship to the source of everything. And there's this growing inner knowledge that I am one with the source. So that's a typical spiritual awakening, right? And that goes all the way up through 150 SQ, which is where the illumination level begins. And that's the throat chakra level, of course, at the fifth center. And this is the typical level of enlightenment. And when I say enlightenment, there's a whole spectrum of what that might mean when someone uses that term. Some people use it synonymously with self realization. And I don't use that word synonymously with that because to me, those are kind of two different levels of SQ. Enlightenment, as defined by the Buddha, is simply the end of suffering. And so the fifth energy center is called the Vishuddha in Sanskrit. And Vishuddha literally means total purification. So it's the energy center that gives us access to the levels of SQ that allow us to discern between the real and the unreal, the true and the false. So we start to perceive non-duality. We start to have a true understanding of, oh, thoughts aren't real. They don't exist. The stories in my mind aren't real. This body is not what I am. It's just a appearance in consciousness. I can't be an object because I'm aware of an object. Whatever I'm aware of, I have to be earlier than that. These are the kinds of understandings that come in at the illumination level. So I call the illumination level or enlightenment level because the mind is illuminated with the light of truth at this level. So at 150 SQ, you essentially don't suffer anymore. And now that's kind of a difficult thing to map as well, because what really constitutes suffering, right? And so the way I describe it is that, and this is just from my own reference frame and what I've read from, the ancient Hindu texts that sort of confirm this, but there is a stage of the enlightenment path where there might still be some old energies in the mind, some old identifications and attachments that will keep coming up for attention. Your mind will keep throwing the fishing line at you, hoping you'll grab onto it, because all these thoughts and stories in our heads need our attention to live. And when we ignore them and just watch them without any kind of personal interest, they lose energy very quick and die off. So sort of like a dying animal, our thoughts, when they're starved of energy, will start coming up in the mind to be given energy. It's their kind of their last ditch attempt to stay alive in the mind. So you may be at this enlightenment level where you're totally clear on what's true and what's not true. You've lost the ability to see yourself as a body, and it's really of no concern to you from an identity standpoint. But they still have thoughts come up that trigger some painful emotions. But at the illumination level and above, we can't really see that it's suffering because there's absolutely no identification. The moment those thoughts and feelings appear, there's instant awareness of, this is just an old pattern coming up for attention, and I'm just going to be aware of it. No big deal. So there's no personalization anymore of what happens in the mind. So although you may still experience negative emotions, it's not really suffering anymore at this level. So that's the illumination level. And when we move up to the third eye level of self-mastery, that is 175 in the SQ chart. And that's where basically any kind of negative energy is impossible to be felt because your energy field is so polarized positively that you've worked out all those negative energies. All the karmas in the system have been dissolved. And you can't actually elevate your SQ to that level until you've cleared your energy field of those negative energies. So it's called the level of self-mastery because it's exactly that. It is one who has totally mastered the content of their mind through their awareness and integration. And so this is the level where one lives from what we call the flow state or non-doership in Advaita Vedanta, where there's such a lack of identification with the body that one just becomes the witness of the body as if you're literally watching anybody else. You have no clue what you're going to do from moment to moment. You find that the body-mind vehicle is just operating perfectly on its own conditioning. The flow of life, the present moment is dictating everything it needs to do. There's no more personal doer in here that's choosing and deciding what to do. You're just responding to the moment through awareness. And so it's an incredibly blissful state of consciousness to live from because there's absolutely no burden placed on the mind anymore. No sense of I'm doing this, I'm responsible, I'm the doer. There's this overwhelming awareness that the one source of all creation is the doer and is doing everything at once. There's no independent self that can ever get in the way of the will of God. So it just kind of, that belief dissolves itself out of the system. So that's the level of mastery at the third eye. And then we finally get to the crown chakra, which I call the singularity level. And that's the 200 plus range. So very, very rare SQ level for someone to arrive at this level of our evolution. But this would be like the Ramana Maharshis, Neem Karoli Babas, Christ, Buddha, the avatars. These are beings that have so become the source in their awareness. They've so merged with the creator that they literally speak and act like their God, right? Like Jesus, some of the famous I am statements. He was a singularity level being who was just incapable of speaking as an individual person anymore. Because the awareness, again, of reality, that there is no individual person, everything is the source expressing itself. That belief has just been expunged from the mind so long ago that there's just this natural kind of effortless speaking as if that person is God, which, of course, in a religious world like Jesus was raised in, people have no way of understanding what level of consciousness this guy is speaking from. And so they just are projecting their belief that I'm a person, I'm a body onto Jesus and thinking he's saying, I, the body, I, the human person, am the Father. We are one. I am God. I'm orchestrating the planets and all that stuff. So that's heresy, obviously, for them. So, Buddha and all of the avatars from India sort of had it pretty good compared to Christ because they were raised in these environments where oneness was understood by the collective consciousness. So people who speak like that aren't such a shock to the cultural system. So I call it the singularity level because that's exactly what it is. It's someone who has completely merged back with the source.
Aaron, thank you so much for explaining that. Is there a way that people can measure their SQ and sort of figure out where they're at on that scale?
Yeah, great question. So I made a video on my SQ series. I think it's number 3, the SQ test, that lays out sort of a roadmap of each of those 7 levels and shows you what kind of things you'll be struggling with at that level of SQ. So it can be sort of a self-assessment. There isn't like a, take this written test and find out, because I don't think SQ could ever work that way. The only assessment would be through your own self-awareness of, okay, yeah, I am still struggling with these things. These kinds of thoughts and feelings are still showing up for me. But in addition to the things that become available at higher levels are also on that list. So especially beginning kind of at the yellow ray, the level of empowerment, the third chakra, when spiritual interest is kind of sparked. These are really easy to know if you're in that range somewhere, because if you even have any interest in like law of attraction teachings, then you're probably at least at the empowerment level. And the way I have it laid out is one section will show you like when you've transcended these things, when these things are no longer showing up for you, then you've definitely graduated from this level and are at least at the next level. So I do make it pretty easy to have a gauge, but in terms of like, can you know exactly what your SQ score is? I don't have a way to do that yet. Again, I don't know if there will be a way, but at least we know within what range somebody might be in.
Okay, perfect. I will have your series, the SQ Spiritual Intelligence series, linked in the description. So anybody can go check that out. There's so much more information there than we'll have time to get into. But could you
Definitely.
talk? Maybe we could spend the rest of our time talking about the 3 states of mastery and how people can begin to experience those states.
Yeah, this is a really fun conversation with the SQ chart, because one of the other things that came clear at some point was that these higher chakras, really beginning at the heart, but especially the upper 3, the heart is kind of, it's the middle of the 7, right? So it's kind of the transition point between our primal self and our spiritual self. So I didn't put a state of mastery at the heart level because I don't see one yet, anything we could call mastery at least. But I do have the mystical state on that level, which is, again, the state we talked about where oneness experiences start to happen, where you start to enter that mystical state of consciousness more frequently. That is absolutely a state that starts to open up when you're in that 125 to 149 SQ level. But once we get to the illumination level at the throat chakra, where we could say that true enlightenment really begins, that's where the first state of mastery is experienced, or we could say where the state of mastery becomes automatic and effortless. So the caveat is these three states of mastery, they're called the I am state, the flow state, and the channeling state. They can be practiced and they can be experienced in fleeting glimpses when you're not at that 150 or above level yet. You can practice being in the I am state absolutely at any SQ level, and it will definitely boost your SQ dramatically if you're practicing that. But you enter that I am state permanently at a 150 level where there's no more need to practice being in the I am state. It's just as natural as your previous state of consciousness was before that. You don't even think about it. And so I call it the I am state because it's the state of what we call mind-heart coherence. So we could say that I in I am would represent the mind, the knowledge of self or self-awareness, and am would be the heart or beingness. And so the throat chakra is right in between the heart and the mind, right? So it's as if when those two points merge at the throat, it's the I am state where the heart, the wisdom of the heart is now leading the show. And that's important because when the mind is left all by itself to discern reality without the loving intelligence that the heart brings, that awareness of oneness we talked about, then the mind just separates everything into compartments and labels and categories. And so it creates a separate universe apart from me. And that's the source of all suffering, right? So we want to endow the mind with the wisdom of the heart, but we can't do that until we've at least activated the heart chakra. So as we begin to activate the heart chakra, that loving intelligence begins to permeate our awareness. And we start to realize that actually these things I've labeled and compartmentalized, they're actually not separate from each other. Like all of this is one interconnected happening. Everything depends on everything else, and everything is a reflection of everything else. Like, wow, that's pretty amazing. And all of a sudden, reality is no longer something to be feared, but something to be loved and worshiped and sought after. So that's the I am state. It's just mind-heart coherence. And at a 150 level of SQ, you're just living there at that point. And then that state transforms slowly as we continue raising our SQ to the level of mastery. It transforms into what I described as the flow state earlier. So now there's so much self-awareness of my universality that I can no longer perceive myself as a body. All the body is at that point is just a vessel for consciousness to be localized in, to have an experience from. But it's not me. It's not what I am. It's just a useful device for consciousness to express itself. And so we live from the flow state where things just happen for us and we feel the power of life moving us. And that's a very, very high level of SQ. And then from there, it transforms eventually to the channeling state at the singularity level of 200 or above. And the channeling state is just where you are in constant communication with the field of consciousness. So we typically call this psychic abilities, telepathy, clairvoyance, clairaudience. They're all channeling abilities, essentially. So many, many people can enter the channeling state, right? And channel extraterrestrials or have really high psychic awareness, but they typically have to be in a trance state or something, right? They have to induce that state. Well, when you reach the singularity level, you live from that state of consciousness. And this is why we see these kinds of avatars like Christ and Neem Karoli Baba and people performing miracles everywhere they go, reading people's minds, telling people what they're thinking, what's going to happen in the future. they don't have to get into a trance to do that, right? They're just tapped in because their SQ level is so high. So the way I like to break these down from a different perspective is also as the 3 levels of higher self incarnation. And this is a model of the SQ series that we get into, like, I think episode 10, 9 or 10, where we talk about how what we essentially are is our higher self dreaming this whole experience. So in the same way that when you go to sleep at night and you're laying in bed and you're having a dream, all kinds of crazy stuff can be happening in your dream, but the dream character's higher self is you sleeping in bed, right? The physical you snoring at 2 a.m. So we become lucid in our dreams when that higher self, the dreamer of the dream, starts to become lucid and goes, wait a minute, this is all my dream. It's not really happening. It's just happening in my mind. And then the higher self can begin to come through the dream and live out the dream. And, as we know in lucid dreams, you can do miracles, right? You can fly, you can create things through thought, all the same things that avatar level beings can do in this dense. So if we use that analogy of a dreamer and the higher self of the dreamer or dream character, we can see that that's literally what's happening right now. That each and every one of us has a higher self, as you know, as a Law of One student. It's our 6th density self that, is our basically the completed version of who we are. It's done every life incarnation that we'll ever do, and it's ran the race and crossed the finish line in time space. So now it's turning in time and revisiting all of its incarnations or dreams and guiding them. So you are the higher self right now, right? If the higher self exists, if there is a completed version of you, then you're that now. That's all that could be true, right? There's just an illusion that you're on the way to get there because you're having this dream. But really, you're that higher self always. And when you reach these levels of mastery, we could say these are the 3 levels of higher self incarnation. So the higher self becomes lucid in this dream when we reach the I am state. And the sort of the flavor of our being comes through, that knowledge of I exist, I am. That's what shines through the body. And that's the sort of the foundation of the higher self. That is the sort of the fragrance that a higher self being would have. If you could meet your higher self, you would feel this I am presence from it. So that comes through us at the 150 level. From there, we reach the flow state, which is the 2nd level of higher self incarnation. And that's where the higher self is fully lucid in the body, witnessing the body. Just like when you're lucid in a dream and you're watching the dream character go through all of its adventures and stuff, but you fully know you're just dreaming. That's the flow state, the 2nd level of mastery. And then the channeling state, of course, is now where the higher self has basically fully become lucid in the body. And now the higher self is speaking, right? Like Jesus or Buddha or Krishna. The higher self is speaking through the body exactly what it would say if it was there in full 3D Technicolor. So when we look at the Law of One, it's really cool to see how the densities actually show us what percentage of the higher self we can actually bring through. And if you know the work of David Hawkins, you'll get this, but I'll just simplify it by saying that David Hawkins wrote The Map of Consciousness, which is a spectrum of the energy level of consciousness on the 3rd density plane. So he mapped it from 0 to 1,000, and it's very similar to the SQ chart in some ways. But it shows what amount of energy consciousness is producing at that level. So if we say that 3rd density ranges from 0 to 1,000, well, muscle testing shows that the 4th density ranges from 1,000 to 5,000. So a 4th density being has the potential to be 5 times more enlightened, you might say, than a Christ or a Buddha, which is crazy to comprehend, right? Then we go to the 5th density, which ranges from 5,000 to 20,000. And then 6th density is from 20,000 to 60,000. So David Hawkins calibrated this. I also calibrated this before I read The Eye of the Eye, where he states this. David Hawkins says that archangels calibrate at 50,000. And I calibrated what does the higher self calibrate at, and it muscle tested at 50,000. And, we could definitely say that a term like archangel could easily represent what we call the higher self, right? A angelic being that has reached that oversoul level, that arc level. So that was pretty amazing to me when I saw that. So I instantly wanted to do the math and said, okay, how much of the higher self can we actually bring through in a third density body? And so if we look at 50,000 is the higher self, a Jesus level avatar is 1,000, then we could say that even all of these states we've talked about, the flow state, the I am state, the channeling state, the most we could bring through of the actual total vibrancy, the frequency of our higher self is just 2%. So this
Wow.
Christ character is only channeling 2% of their higher self because the third density body just doesn't have the circuitry to go higher than that. At the fourth density level, we can channel up to 10% of the higher self. At the fifth density level, they can channel up to 40% of the higher self. And then finally, we reach that sixth density level where we finish our final incarnation and actually become the higher self.
Wow. Amazing. So the higher up you go in densities, the more of the higher self you can actually channel, or I don't know what the correct word would be, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, because the physical vehicle is a higher vibration, right? A
Mhm.
higher density. A fifth density being is a full light body, full electromagnetic energy. Whereas we are that too, right? A third density body, what you're seeing on the screen is an electromagnetic event, but there's a lot more chemical makeup in that energy as well that makes it look more dense and solid.
Mm.
A fourth density being is like 50% chemical, 50% electromagnetic energy. Fifth density is 100% a light body. So they can change their body's form through thought alone. There's no more physical matter involved in it. So they're able to channel a much higher frequency of consciousness than, a third density body could.
Mhm. So what you're saying is that things just get better and better and better for us the higher we
That is what
evolve.
I'm saying. Yep. Lot
So
to look forward to.
yeah, absolutely. So do you have any quick tips for people on how they can begin to raise their spiritual intelligence?
Absolutely. Any real spiritual practice is the raising of spiritual intelligence in some way. But what's the simplest way we could describe it? And we said in the beginning that it's our capacity for self-awareness and integration. So, firstly, on the self-awareness aspect, the most important faculty of spiritual growth is one's ability to be the observer. Can you just get into the habit of watching your life like you're watching a movie? Pretend it's like a virtual reality movie or something, but it's just a movie. It's a film going on, and you're observing what this person is doing and saying. The more you do that, the more you're increasing your capacity to be self aware and to notice where certain things are coming from. And we basically, on this level of density, we are here to heal and open and unblock our three lower chakras, which are kind of like our animal nature, our primal nature, survival, selfishness, control, and manipulation of others. These are more animalistic behaviors that become exalted to their highest expression once the heart is opened and above, where that, again, that loving intelligence can now show the animal mind, hey, there's nothing to fear here. We're not separate, so we can lay down all those weapons, right? So being aware, being the observer is number one. What happens after that, though, is that you now have all these new things to integrate into the way you respond to life, the way that you show up in the world, right? Your beingness itself has to change and be upgraded because existence and consciousness are one. They're not separate. So every movement consciousness makes, every thought, every feeling has to have a perfect reflection in existence somewhere. We call this the law of attraction, right? What you think about is what you will manifest. And we're just not really aware of how much we're doing this. But if we just take the onus that every little negative thought that I think and identify with, I give energy to a thought when I identify with it. And that's my creative power. Perception is creation. So when I see a thought in the mind and go, that's my thought, I'm thinking that, and then I, you know, give it all kinds of personal interest. Well, now I've just told the universe, this is an experience I want. So bring me an experience that matches the frequency of this thought. So we will keep re-experiencing all of that karma until we become aware of it and start to transcend it. Meaning that thought pattern goes through the mind, and we have awareness now and say, no, 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 I'm not going to run off with that thing and go into the sad story or whatever it is. I'm just going to let it be there. And that's us sending a message to the universe saying, I'm ready to transcend this pattern, this thought. So when we're no longer giving energy to those thoughts, we're keeping more energy to ourselves. So we are the microcosm of the macrocosm. Every possible event in the universe is encased, is compressed within us in sort of like quantum potential. So every thought you think is your attempt to bring some one of those infinite potentials into existence and experience it. You're the creator, so you can create whatever you want. And so when we're giving tons of attention to these thoughts in our mind, identified with thoughts, the mind is creating a lot, but it's an unconscious creating, right? It's creating all of its own suffering and misery. When we stop doing that and we become the observer, we now keep more of that energy to ourselves. And then the energy stays in its informational state, which is pure intelligence, and it starts to restructure itself and upgrade itself. Because all energy is spiraling upwards. All energy is moving back towards the creator. It's always evolving. It's always becoming more intelligent. So when we stop grabbing on to thoughts where they are and we leave them, then we allow the mind to slowly upgrade those thoughts and find higher vibrational representations of them. And we notice that we become more loving, more open, more connected, more peaceful. And this is because our sense of self is expanding, right? The more expansive my sense of self is, the less I suffer. It's the contraction of my being that causes me to suffer. And it's the expansion of my being that causes me to feel happy. So if you think about what would it feel like to be infinite? Like if you could have the experience of the creator, the source, what does it feel like to be infinite and to know you're infinite? And we call this bliss or ananda in spirituality. Sat Chit Ananda is the Hindu sort of explanation of the nature of reality. It is existence, consciousness, and bliss. So where existence and consciousness become one, we realize I am all that is. It is felt as bliss. That's just the natural state of being. It's our default state. It's the state the source is always in. So the less that I'm giving energy to thoughts, the more energy I keep to expand myself with. So it's really just through being aware of our thoughts and patterns, noticing them and noticing what's not in alignment with truth, what's based in fear, what's based in separation, what's based in victimization. Become aware of those things in your mind. Look for those tendencies the mind has to victimize itself, to complain, to get prideful, to get jealous, to get afraid, all of those things, right? If it causes suffering, it's coming from the mind, not the true self. And it's really just by virtue of being aware of those things that we allow them to become integrated. But to give a little more practical advice to the integration aspect, Ace Am talks about the practice of forgiveness and says forgiveness really is the way to heaven. And that's a really amazing view of the Enlightenment path, I think, because number one, you just don't really see any other texts talk about enlightenment as the path of forgiveness. But forgiveness really is the ultimate way to integrate by healing the shadow, because all we really have to do is get rid of all the falsities that obscure our true nature. We don't gain our true nature. So like we don't integrate something good that we didn't have before. We just clear the room out for what's good in us to express. And that's what forgiveness does, right? Forgiveness is you remembering who you are and refusing to take this limited perception of yourself anymore. So, like, oh, they did that to me. That was so unfair. How could they treat me like that? Those kinds of stories can only be healed by just being tired of seeing yourself as such a pathetic, fragile little version of what you are. That just a mere word, a mere action on someone else's part can shatter me and ruin my life. I mean, it's just a really miserable, disempowered way of seeing yourself. And so forgiveness is the ultimate act of empowerment. It's saying, I'm not defined by what has happened to me. I'm not defined by other people's actions. So I'm not going to play this game anymore and suffer, right? I forgive you. You didn't know what you were doing. Obviously, you were coming from a low state of consciousness. I'm not going to hold that against you anymore. Because if I am holding it against you, all that's really doing is showing that I'm coming from a lower state of consciousness. So forgiveness really is kind of the ultimate active integration because it clears those obstructions from our energy centers when we truly do it. And it's easy to fake forgiveness, right? It's to be an ongoing thing where that thing may pop up for you dozens of times over the course of 3 to 6 months or whatever, while you're really working on healing that thing. And that's because those thought patterns have a lot of energy. We've spent decades of our lives feeding those stories with attention and interest. And so you better believe it might take a while to burn all that energy out. But every time you're aware of it, you say, no, I'm not going to identify with that story. I forgive that person, or I forgive myself. You're just sort of pulling the carpet out from underneath the ego and draining it of energy. And just by eliminating the negative energy in our energy field, we allow the positive energy to express itself more, where these higher states of consciousness just start manifesting.
Wow, thank you so much. That's so helpful and so practical. I'd like to give you a chance to talk about your new program that you have, 4D University.
Yeah, super excited about this. I've wanted to create for a long time a kind of sort of step by step guide to this enlightenment path that sort of anyone who's hungry for this, for these teachings, can put themselves through this curriculum and just learn all of the most important fundamentals for what does it really take to expand your consciousness? How does how do things like healing and shadow work actually happen? How do we turn these things from ideas or concepts into lived realities? And so I have a master class for the last 2.5 years called Master Your Mind. And I wanted to use that as the foundation for it. So I sort of redid the whole course this year, refilmed everything, rewrote everything, and really upgraded it. And that became the first course in the 4DU curriculum. The second one is called Meditation Mastery, which is helping you to really master this incredibly powerful practice of meditation and all the benefits it has for expanding consciousness. It's just the ultimate tool for that. And then we finally get to the third course, which is called 4DAP, which stands for Fourth Density Ascension Protocol. And so the idea of 4D University is essentially to take somebody from a third density state of consciousness to a fourth density state of consciousness, or what we call enlightenment. And that is usually it's understood as a purely mental process. Like I have to read more books, I have to understand non-duality more and things like that. And that certainly is a part of it. But from my own experience and from what the Law of One shares, it is actually also a very much a neurobiological process. The whole nervous system has to be upgraded, as we talked about with the densities. How we just at our current level we don't have the capacity to channel that kind of energy until the nervous system gets upgraded and can conduct more power. And so that's what actually happens when we transition from a third to a fourth density state. We've heard it called Kundalini awakening typically, but Ra actually describes it as the activation of the green ray body, which is the fourth energy center of the heart. Each energy center is its own energetic body, and the average person is just running from a yellow ray body. But when we expand our consciousness to the fourth density, which is the awareness of oneness, we actually activate the green ray body, which lies in potential at the base of the spine. And that energy starts moving its way up the spine like a serpent, and then makes its way up to the brain, and then through the brain goes back down into the gut and starts transforming the whole human nervous system. And this is the process of a Kundalini awakening that we've all heard about and read about. But I wanted to give a platform to the world that could facilitate this transformation in a safe, gradual way. And it's not really something that humanity has a lot of knowledge on at this point in where we are, but it is a very systematic process that one can take themselves through if they're willing to do what it takes. And so it's partially, again, applying and integrating these spiritual understandings and living them out, being of service to others, living from the heart, forgiving. But it's also a matter of actually stimulating the nervous system through advanced yoga practices and breath work and things like that. So 4D University is actually designed to physically take someone to the fourth density level by awakening the Kundalini. We don't use that language as much in 4DU because we kind of take the law of one's lens on it, but we're 3 weeks in and everyone is just having the time of their life and loving this community we've built of being able to go on this ascension journey together. So I really can't wait to see what it's going to be like in a year from now.
Yeah, I'm so excited about it, and I have been ever since you first announced it. So I'll have the link for that in the description, as well as all of your other links. Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to do this and to share some of your experience and wisdom with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Melissa.
Thank you for watching and listening. Your views, likes, comments, and shares truly make the biggest difference in supporting this channel. Don't forget to check the show notes for all the links to today's guest, as well as my links. You'll find me on social media at Love Covered Life, my website, lovecoveredlife.com, and the Be a Guest link for anybody who would like to be a guest on the channel. I have great news. Love Covered Life podcast is coming available on audio podcast. You can find it wherever you listen to your audio podcasts.